God's wrath, fire and brimstone, the cities of the plain destroyed. Sodom and Gomorrah, along with a dozen other cities, were wiped from the earth for their sins by the hand of God, or so the biblical book of Genesis says. But in the 21st century Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, archaeologists have excavated a site which they say is the true location of Sodom, a byword for fornication and sin. And not only that, they can explain how the city was vaporized more than 3,000 years ago. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from heaven, and he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the plain, and that which grew upon the ground. Abraham got up early in the morning to the place where he stood before the Lord, and he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land, and beheld, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, God destroyed the cities of the plain. Perhaps one of the most widely known stories of the Bible, the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah is also recounted in Jewish and Islamic scriptures, and many of the terms and phrases used within the biblical narratives of their destruction have entered the common language. The term sodomy itself became part of criminal law codes for centuries, and the practice remains illegal to the present day in parts of the world. This infamy and fascination with the vaporization of the two Bronze Age cities is not a medieval Christian or modern phenomenon, as there is overwhelming textual evidence that Sodom and Gomorrah remained continuously etched in the minds of Near Eastern populations from the time of the destructive event itself. While the ruin of the towns is described in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, and in the 21st century, scientists have uncovered new evidence that a gigantic meteor explosion may in fact have caused the apocalyptic damage. Sodom is referenced in the Old Testament Hebrew books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Maccabees, among others, while in the New Testament, Jesus Christ warned his followers of the fate that can befall those who fail to treat others with kindness and hospitality. Whosoever shall not receive you, nor hear your words, when ye depart out of that city, shake off the dust of your feet. Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. Matthew 10:14-15. 3 decades later, the Jewish Roman historian Josephus explained why the two towns were destroyed by the hand of God. About this time, the Sodomites grew proud on account of their riches and great wealth. They became unjust towards men and impious towards God, insomuch that they did not call to mind the advantages they received from him. They hated strangers and abused themselves with sodomitical practices. God was therefore much displeased at them, and determined to punish them for their pride and to overthrow their city and to lay waste to their country, until there should neither plant nor fruit grow out of it. As it occupies a particularly prominent place in the historical and popular imagination, speculation of Sodom and Gomorrah's likely location was long-standing, but until the last 2 decades, it was generally presumed that the towns had lain in the area of the mountain that shares its name with one of the ill-fated settlements, Mount Sodom in the Judean desert. Intriguingly for some, a prominent rock feature in the area also corresponds in its appearance to the biblical reference to the wife of Lot being turned to a pillar of salt for disobeying God's command and looking back on the burning city. There was also a strand of thought that the biblical story was just that, a myth or fable with no real or factual basis. This was the case with other legendary or biblical events, like the Trojan War and the existence of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, who ordered the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. But the factuality of these historical mysteries was solved, first in the late 19th century by the excavations at Hisarlik in modern Turkey, and the discovery of Bronze Age settlements corresponding to ancient descriptions of Troy, and later in the 1960s when researchers unearthed the Pilate Stone, a 2,000-year-old stele documenting the presence of a Roman prefect named Pontius Pilate in the Near East. With these discoveries, the idea that biblical stories like Sodom and Gomorrah perhaps had a factual root became more likely, and certain academics were inspired to search for them. Southern Dead Sea sites like edh-Dhra and Numeira have been proposed for the possible locations of Sodom. But in recent years, a highly controversial suggestion has been made by Professor Stephen Collins, Dean of the College of Archaeology and Biblical History at the independent Trinity Southwest University. There are other people who have corroborated the theory. Collins has led archaeological digs around the Kingdom of Jordan and the West Bank, and he originally followed the theory that the southern Dead Sea sites were possible locations for Sodom and Gomorrah. In the early 2000s, however, while on a break from work in the West Bank area due to political instability, Collins came to the conclusion that the site at Tal el-Hammam was the true location of Sodom. A closer reading of the biblical text indicated to Collins that Sodom and Gomorrah were located in the northern areas of the Jordanian plain. This comes from a description of the travels of Abraham and his nephew Lot in the book of Genesis, chapter 13. The narrative describes the two men and their extended families and servants moving up from Egypt to the north of the Dead Sea, before making the decision to part ways so as to preserve resources. They agree specifically to go right and left, east and west, and the chapter then describes Lot, who lived in Sodom at the time of the destruction, looking over the Jordanian plain. Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou camest unto Zoar. Genesis 13:10. Collins identifies the term well-watered as being instructive. The River Jordan, like the Nile, rises and overflows its banks north of the Dead Sea. This is referred to specifically in the later book of Joshua, chapter 3, verse 15. Collins concluded that Lot and thus the city of Sodom were located north of the Dead Sea. He then began searching for a site that was large enough to fit the descriptions of Bronze Age Sodom. He found it at a place called Tal el-Hammam. Collins was not the first to survey the area, which lies very close to the point where the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea. French surveyors had noted the area in the late 19th century, recording that it contained Roman baths from both the Imperial and late Antique periods. American and Australian researchers visited in the 1940s and 1970s, expanding on the work done in the previous century. When Collins began excavating the Tal el-Hammam site after years of persistence to gain permission of the Jordanian government, the first layer of finds revealed Iron Age settlements, but the next layers below the Iron Age were dated to the Middle Bronze Age, indicating that the Tal el-Hammam site was unoccupied for a period of 700 years. He also claimed that he has found pottery fragments dating to the Bronze Age, which originally appeared glazed, but were in fact burned by a heat that humans could not produce technologically until the late Roman and Islamic eras 2,000 years later. Burned grain found scattered was also carbon dated to 1750 BC, the same period in which Hebrew sources placed the lifetime of the prophet Abraham and Lot, both of whom the Bible recounts were present at the time of Sodom's destruction. Collins identifies Tal el-Hammam as a city-state, a political entity based on a fortified urban center, much the same as ancient Athens and Sparta, outside of which would have sat fortified towns and garrisons, perhaps only a kilometer from the main center, and then dozens and sometimes hundreds of hamlets and farmlands in the surrounding area. There was no evidence of a military defeat in the Bronze Age, though the Bible does describe Sodom being looted and its citizens taken as captives earlier in Genesis, and it says that earthquakes did not affect the city particularly, as it had the capability to rebuild quickly. The site had internal water supplies and plentiful stores of food, and the hot spring and summer climate would have made sieges very difficult, if not impossible, for an attacking army. In addition to hypothesizing on the location of Sodom at Tal el-Hammam, Professor Collins has also offered an explanation for the biblical description of fire from heaven. In this scenario, the physical destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah came from a meteoric airburst, which Professor Collins says would have exploded over the Dead Sea when a fragment of comet or meteorite came through the Earth's atmosphere at such a rate that it exploded before it hit the ground and showered the underlying areas with a superheated plasma. In the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, this explosion happened over the Dead Sea, so that in addition to being showered with the burning stones of biblical description, the towns would also have been hit with waves of boiling salt water from the sea. As evidence of this, the soil of the Tal el-Hammam site has a very high salinity level, 5 times more at its Middle Bronze Age layer than either the periods above or below. Collins cites the Tunguska, Siberia incident of 1908 as a similar instance of a meteoric airburst, as well as the more recent Chelyabinsk meteor, which caused nearly 1,500 injuries and damage to more than 7,000 buildings. Videos captured of the Chelyabinsk incident show a streaking fireball coming from the sky, which then explodes in mid-air and rains burning stone and boulders down on the earth below. With the Genesis passage in mind, it looks remarkably like the description of the disaster that befell Sodom and Gomorrah. Though the Tal el-Hammam site has been identified as the possible location of Sodom and Gomorrah for more than a decade by the team working on its excavation, a September 2021 article in Scientific Reports and published on Nature.com saying, "It is worth speculating that a remarkable catastrophe such as the destruction of Tal el-Hammam by a cosmic object may have generated an oral tradition that, after being passed down through many generations, became the source of the written story of biblical Sodom in Genesis, caused a wave of controversy online, with many established archaeologists and researchers attacking the authors of the piece and Stephen Collins for their alleged lack of qualifications and methodology. The authors and Collins stand adamant in their theory despite the opprobrium, and El-Hammam is an active archaeological site as of summer 2023. No doubt it will reveal further secrets over the coming years, though the likely truth of its greatest mystery will remain hidden. Nevertheless, it stands as an intriguing example of how a seemingly supernatural event, thousands of years old, might be explained by modern science and observation. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel, like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments below.